No one in the
Help!
quiet town of Ashton could explain why, just before
I
losing
need help!
consciousness, Emily Hartman left a
Get it
trembling
off
voicemail
me!
whispering, "Don't blame him." Her final words for the very snake wrapped around her neck. That night, inside the dim red glow of her reptile room, only the storm outside and her fading breaths witnessed what truly happened. What unfolded in those final seconds? And why would she defend the creature that took her life? The voicemail began with a scrape, not a word, like someone fumbling the phone across tile. For a second, there was only heavy breathing, quick and shallow, then the faint clatter of something metallic hitting the floor. A woman's voice came through, strained and distant, as if the phone lay yards away instead of inches from her hand. "If anything happens," she gasped, the words torn off by a choked sound that wasn't quite a cough and wasn't quite a scream. In the background, something dragged softly, fabric across concrete, rubber against glass. Another breath, weaker this time, and 4 words that made no sense to the woman who would hear them later. "Don't blame him. Please." Then silence, not the kind filled by static or room noise, but the heavy, unnatural stillness that makes your skin prickle. The voicemail auto-ended after a few more seconds, saved like any other message. Time-stamped, cataloged, harmless-looking, in a notification bar. No alarms went off. No system flagged it as a cry for help. It just waited. By the time Lisa finally saw the missed call, the sun had already slipped behind the low line of pines outside Ashton, Colorado. A storm front was rolling in from the mountains, turning the sky the color of old bruises. She glanced at her phone while rinsing dishes, thumb hovering over Emily's name without pressing play, telling herself she'd listen once her hands were dry, once the water was off, once, later. Across town, blue and red lights swept across tidy front yards and parked pickups, washing the quiet street in emergency color. A Benton County Sheriff's cruiser stopped outside a small rental house at the edge of Ashton, its porch light flickering, the yard half gravel, half stubborn weeds. Behind it, a volunteer fire truck pulled up, followed by an ambulance whose siren had gone mercifully silent. The first deputy stepped out, breath forming faint clouds in the cooling air. He'd been told it was a welfare check, nothing more. Family couldn't reach a 34-year-old woman who worked long shifts at the vet clinic. It was almost routine. Almost. He knocked once, then again, harder this time, calling out her name. "Emily? Sheriff's office? You home?" No answer. The only response was the dull rattle of the loose porch light swaying in the breeze. Mark Harris arrived seconds later, still pulling on his turnout jacket as he jogged up the walk. He wasn't there as Emily's ex-boyfriend tonight, just another volunteer on a call. Least, that's what he told himself. His chest tightened when he saw the address printed on the dispatch slip. He'd been here 100 times, Sunday dinners, lazy afternoons, arguments on this very porch. He knew the color of the hallway walls inside without having to picture them. When no one came to the door, the deputy circled the house, peering through dark windows. One side room glowed in a strange, dim amber, the kind of light heat lamps cast in reptile enclosures. The blinds were partially drawn, but from the corner he could make out the silhouette of stacked glass tanks and the faint trace of movement behind one of them. Not human, he thought. Something slower, something that slid. "Back door's locked," he called as he returned. Mark was already on the porch, hand hovering near the knob, jaw tight. "She would have answered," Mark said quietly, half to himself. "Even if she was mad at me, she would have answered." The deputy weighed procedure against the knot forming in his gut. A storm on the way, no contact all day, lights on in that back room. It was enough. "We're going in!" The crack of the door being forced open echoed down the block, causing a curtain to twitch in the house across the street. Old Mr. Calvin, who spent his evenings watching the neighborhood from his recliner, muted the TV and leaned forward, recognizing the address instantly. "That's the Snake Girl's place," he muttered to no one, the glow of emergency lights dancing across his living room walls. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been, thick with the smell of disinfectant, damp substrate, and something metallic underneath. The hallway was narrow, lined with photos of animals Emily had treated at the clinic, rescued dogs, barn cats, a rescued hawk with one wing. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow the men as they moved toward the low, humming glow, bleeding under the reptile room door. Mark reached that door first. His hand shook as he turned the knob. For a split second he hesitated, remembering all the times he'd argued with her about this room. The racks of tanks, the heat lamps, the enclosures, she swore were safer than they looked. "You can't control everything with love, Em," he'd told her once, frustrated. She just smiled and said, "Watch me." The memory flashed, then vanished as the door swung inward. The scene on the other side did not rush at him. It settled instead, like a nightmare revealed in slow motion. The room looked almost ordinary at first. Rows of glass enclosures, warming pads glowing beneath, laminated care sheets pinned to the walls. Then his eyes found the middle of the floor. Emily lay on her back, hair fanned out, one arm crooked at an unnatural angle. Her face was pale, lips bluish, eyes half-lidded, staring at a point on the ceiling that only she could see. Coiled around her neck and shoulders was Orion. The reticulated python's body gleamed under the red heat lamps, patterned in golds and grays that would have been beautiful in any other context. Its massive coils rested like a grotesque scarf, thick as a man's forearm, muscles relaxed now in the aftermath of work already done. Its head lay near her shoulder, tongue flicking lazily at the air, tasting a world that had gone suddenly terribly quiet. For one irrational heartbeat, Mark thought the snake was comforting her, draped over her like some twisted guard dog refusing to leave its owner. Then he saw the faint indentations across her neck, the way her chest failed to rise, and the illusion shattered. "Get it off her!" he barked, voice cracking. The deputy radioed for medics as Mark lunged forward, hands digging under the heavy coils he'd helped lift dozens of times before when Emily was cleaning. Orion did not hiss, did not strike, did not tighten its grip. It simply yielded, muscle by muscle, as Mark and the deputy unwound its body from Emily's throat. The ease of it made Mark's stomach churn. It was like peeling ivy from a fence post, something that had taken its hold slowly, relentlessly, and now let go only because there was nothing left to fight. When the last loop slid free, the paramedics moved in, but the room already felt like a place things had ended, not begun. Out in the kitchen, on the small table where Emily usually dropped her keys and half-finished coffee mugs, her phone lay face up. The screen was locked, battery icon a sliver of red. A single notification banner glowed across the top. One unheard voicemail from Emily H. Lisa would see that message later, hours after the coroner's van left, after the tape went up, after the storm finally broke over Ashton, washing the street clean but changing nothing inside that house. When she finally pressed play, sitting alone in her car outside the clinic where she and Emily had shared countless tired laughs, the message would play out in those jagged, broken breaths and half-formed words. She would replay it over and over, trying to find fear in Emily's voice and hearing something else instead. Regret, love, a desperate need to protect the very creature that had just taken her life. And like everyone else, she would ask the same question. Why, in those final seconds, when the world narrowed to the size of a constricting coil and a failing airway, would Emily Hartman, known to the internet as Savannah Calloway, use her last breath not to ask for help, but to say one impossible thing? Don't blame him? Ashton, Colorado wasn't the kind of town that made the news. It was the place people passed through on their way to somewhere louder, bigger, more important. A handful of stoplights, a diner that still served coffee in chipped white mugs, a hardware store that smelled like oil and dust, the kind of place where folks knew your truck by the sound of its engine. On weekday mornings, if you drove past the small strip mall near the edge of town, you could spot Emily. Hartman's car parked crooked behind the veterinary clinic. She was always there before opening, lights on in the back, tending to animals that had spent the night. Old dogs after surgery, barn cats in metal cages, a limping sheep someone couldn't afford to lose. Emily wasn't the vet. She never went to some big-name university or hung a framed diploma with Latin words on the wall. She was a veterinary technician, the one who held trembling paws and calmed shaking owners, who knew how to read a chart and a dog's eyes with the same kind of care. The vet did the talking, Emily did the holding, the cleaning, the quietly saving. She hadn't planned on reptiles. Growing up, she'd been the kid who brought home stray kittens and injured birds, not snakes. Her mother hated anything that slithered and made the sign of the cross if she saw so much as a garden snake near the porch. Emily remembered that years later, the first time she held a ball python and realized it wasn't cold or slimy. It was warm, curious, afraid of her more than she was of it. The first snake that truly changed her life didn't even belong to her. It came into the clinic in a cardboard box lined with old towels. A half-starved, reticulated python someone in the next county over had surrendered after an eviction. Animal control dropped it off with a shrug, like they were leaving a broken lamp. "If you can't place it, we'll figure something out," the officer had said, eyes sliding away. Emily had lifted the lid and gone very still. The snake's body was coiled loosely, skin dull, eyes sunk just enough to make its head look too big. It flicked its tongue once, tasting the air, tasting her. There was something in the way it moved, slow but aware, that tugged at the same part of her that once couldn't walk past a shivering stray without stopping. "Does it have a name?" she'd asked. No one knew, so she gave it one: Orion. At first, Orion was just another case, a medical problem to solve. She logged his weight, monitored his hydration, charted his feeding attempts on a clipboard the way she did with every patient. But snakes don't wag their tails or purr. They respond with subtler things: less hissing, steadier breathing, a body that doesn't flinch when you reach in. Over weeks, she began to notice those changes. Orion began to recognize the rhythm of her visits. It didn't take long before the clinic ran out of space. A reticulated python, even in poor condition, was not a small commitment. The vet suggested transferring him to a rescue 2 hours away. Emily drove to see the facility, stared at rows of overburdened enclosures and volunteers stretched thin, and felt a quiet dread settle in her chest. On the ride back, with rain streaking across the windshield, she made a decision. That evening, she cleared out the storage room in her little rental house, stacked boxes in the hallway, moved old furniture to the shed, scrubbed the floor until the bleach stung her nostrils. She ordered heat lamps and thermostats online, reading reviews late into the night. When the equipment arrived, she assembled it with the same careful patience she used to place IV lines. "Hartman Haven," she joked to herself, tracing the words in the dust on a shelf. Word got around the clinic that Emily was the reptile girl now. Farmhands started asking, half embarrassed, if she could take the odd turtle or lizard their kids had grown tired of. A bearded dragon missing toes, a corn snake someone found in a foreclosed house. The front desk began to keep a quiet list. "Ask Emily first." Bit by bit, her back room filled with glass and light and the soft rustle of scales on bedding. Outside that world, she still lived an ordinary life. She paid rent late more often than she liked. She forgot to pick up her own prescriptions while remembering every animal's scheduled medication down to the hour. Lisa teased her about it over coffee on Sunday mornings, sitting at the same booth in the diner, watching Emily scroll through photos of enclosures on her phone like other people scrolled through vacation shots. Mark had fallen in love with her long before the snakes, back when they were both just kids who worked too much and slept too little. He was the one who helped her haul the first heavy tank up the narrow stairs, grunting and laughing, bumping his shoulder into the wall. But the more the room filled, the more he watched her attention tilt toward that crimson glow at the end of the hallway, and something in him pulled back. For all their differences, most folks in Ashton agreed on one thing: Emily had a way with animals. Old Mr. Calvin, who lived across the street and claimed he didn't like anybody, had watched her coax a terrified stray dog out from under his truck with nothing but a soft voice and a handful of treats. "Never seen anything like it," he later muttered to his niece. "Critters just decide to trust her." It was that same trust she believed she'd earned with Orion. When he was finally strong enough to move with real power, she held him differently, more mindful of his weight, more respectful of his reach. But she still saw the same creature she'd nursed from the edge of starvation. In her mind, he wasn't a reticulated python capable of killing a person. He was the sixth stray she took home and nursed back to life, a responsibility, a victory. If you had asked Emily on a quiet evening when the clinic doors were locked and the only sound was the hum of incubators and the ticking of the old clock above the door, she would have told you she understood the risks. She could list statistics, cite safety guidelines, explain enclosures and feeding protocols. She had read the horror stories and filed them away as rare, tragic, the exception, things that happened to people who didn't know any better. But the truth, the part she said only to Lisa after a long day, was softer than that. "They're not monsters," she'd insist, nursing a mug of tea gone cold. "People only ever see the headlines. They don't see the hours, the work, the years of nothing going wrong." Lisa would nod, not entirely convinced, but unwilling to push. It was clear that somewhere along the way, the reptiles had become more than animals to Emily. They were proof that the world could misunderstand something and still be wrong. Long before anyone outside Ashton heard the name Savannah Calloway, before the story turned into a thumbnail and a title bar, Emily Hartman was just the woman you called when your dog was sick, your cat was missing, or you found something in your garage that moved in a way you didn't like. She answered those calls without complaint. It made what would happen later all the more impossible to believe, that the one creature she'd refused to see as a threat would be the one to silence her last cry. The warnings didn't arrive all at once. They drifted into Emily's life the way weather changed in Ashton, slowly at first, almost politely, before settling into something heavier. The first came on a warm Saturday morning when Nate stopped by with a box of feeder mice, hoping she'd let him help again. She smiled, distracted, not noticing the way Orion tracked the motion of the box like a living compass. When she opened Orion's enclosure, the big python lifted his head, just slightly, sensing the heat and scent from across the room. Nate stepped closer, holding the box out, proud to be trusted. That pride vanished when Orion lunged, not at him, but in his direction, striking so fast it was a blur of scales and instinct. Emily pulled the box away, voice calm but firm, guiding Nate gently behind her. "He's just eager," she said, but her hands trembled. Later that day, Mark heard the story from Nate's mother, who heard it from Nate, who exaggerated it just enough to make Mark's stomach twist. He drove over, knocking on her door harder than he meant to. Emily answered with a towel over her shoulder, still smelling faintly of disinfectant and heat lamps. His voice rose before he could stop it. "You can't keep doing this alone, Em. One day you're going to misjudge, and it won't be a near miss." She bristled at his tone, folding her arms and leaning against the doorframe like she could hold her ground through posture alone. "I've been doing this for years," she said. "Orion knows me. I know him." Mark stared back, unable to say what he felt. That the more confident she became, the more fragile the situation seemed. They ended the conversation the way so many of theirs ended back then, quietly, with neither convinced. A few weeks later, another warning arrived, this one from old Mr. Calvin across the street. Emily was carrying a heavy bag of substrate when Orion shifted unexpectedly during a routine handling session. His tail brushed her wrist, coiling just a bit too long, too tight, leaving a faint purple band beneath her skin. She shook it off. "He's getting stronger," she laughed, unaware of Calvin watching from his porch. He walked over the next afternoon, leaning on his cane. "I've been around long enough to know when something ain't right," he said, eyes drifting toward the window of the reptile room. "That thing's big enough to make decisions you can't undo." Emily thanked him politely, reassured him, and closed the door, then rubbed at her wrist, the bruise barely visible, but impossible to ignore. Even the town seemed to sense something was off. A customer at the clinic, one of those anxious types who worried about everything, filed a quiet complaint with the city, claiming he'd seen a massive snake shadow near Emily's window. It wasn't true, but the complaint still sent a local officer to her door. He took one look inside, noted her clean enclosures and proper permits, and apologized for the intrusion. "You're within code," he said. "Some folks just get nervous." Emily apologized back, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. For the rest of the evening, she worked in near silence, checking temperatures twice, adjusting locks she usually trusted. The room felt different, too bright, too quiet, as if the animals sensed the tension humming beneath her routines. Orion lay coiled in the far corner of his enclosure, motionless, watching her with steady, unblinking focus. Despite everything, Emily posted a photo that night, a soft, moody shot of Orion under warm red light. The caption read, "Fear is easy. Respect takes work." Her friends hit like. Nate left a string of snake emojis. Lisa sent a thumbs up, but followed it with a text. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been different lately." Emily answered, "Just tired," then set her phone aside before she could second-guess the lie. Deep down, she knew the bruise on her wrist wasn't the real warning. It was the feeling that accompanied it. A slow, creeping sense that Orion had crossed some invisible threshold she couldn't quite define. He wasn't aggressive, not in a way she could point to, but something in his movements felt heavier, more deliberate, as if he'd grown into a version of himself she hadn't prepared for. Still, she continued her routines. Every feeding, every enclosure cleaning, every late-night temperature check became part of a rhythm she trusted more than her doubts. She told herself she wasn't reckless. She'd saved Orion after all. She'd nursed him through dehydration, infections, long nights of uncertainty. She understood him, didn't she? That meant something. It had to. When she confided in Lisa one night over tea, her voice was smaller than usual. "Sometimes I think he's different," she admitted, searching the rim of her mug for courage. "Not bad, just more aware, like he's reading the room." Lisa frowned gently. "Snakes don't read rooms, they react." Emily nodded, but her eyes stayed distant, replaying the moments she couldn't explain. And yet every time she thought about stepping back, reducing her handling time, maybe even transferring Orion to a sanctuary with more staff, she felt something tighten in her chest. Giving him up felt like betraying years of work, of healing, of quiet victories no one else saw. Letting go wasn't in her nature. Not with animals, not with people, not with Orion. By the end of summer, the warnings had piled up like small stones. None large enough to force her hand, but together they formed a weight she carried every time she opened the reptile room door. She would pause for a moment before flipping on the light, letting the warm red glow spill across her face. Then, with a steadying breath, she'd step inside, telling herself the same thing she'd said from the start. He trusts me, and I trust him. She never realized how fragile that promise really was. The storm that rolled over Ashton that evening didn't arrive with thunder. It began as a low, uneasy hush, wind shifting through pine branches, clouds gathering in a slow, bruised swirl over the foothills. People noticed it the way they noticed everything in a small town, quietly, with a quick glance at the sky and a muttered, "Weather's changing." Inside the clinic, Emily wiped down the exam tables, humming under her breath as she worked through the last tasks of her shift. She should have gone home hours earlier, but the day had run long, an injured barn cat, a limping border collie, a bottle-fed goat that needed medication. By the time she hung up her scrubs, the sky outside had turned the color of wet slate. She pulled out her phone and saw 2 missed texts. One from Lisa, asking if she wanted dinner, another from Mark, a short, cautious, "Everything okay?" She answered Lisa first. "Give me an hour. Need to check on Orion." Mark's message she didn't open. Some conversations felt heavy, even before they began. By the time she reached her rental house, wind was sweeping dust and old leaves across the gravel driveway, rattling the metal gutters. The porch light flickered, the way it always did before a storm. Emily hesitated on the top step, sensing the strange pressure in the air, the shift that animals always felt before people did. For a moment, she thought she should wait. Then she unlocked the door. Inside, the house carried the faint warmth of the day's sunlight trapped in the walls, but the deeper she walked, the colder it felt. The back hallway led to the reptile room, where a soft red glow leaked through the bottom of the closed door. She paused there, listening. The hum of heat lamps, the quiet click of thermostats. That part was familiar, comforting, routine. She pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The air inside was warmer immediately, thick with the scent of substrate and the barely noticeable musk of reptiles. Rows of glass enclosures lined the walls, their occupants shifting lazily as she passed. The storm outside pressed against the window, shaking the old frame. Orion's enclosure sat near the far wall, a massive custom-built tank reinforced with latches and heat controls Emily checked twice a day. The python was coiled near the front glass tonight, body moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He lifted his head as Emily approached, tongue flicking, tasting the shift in temperature she hadn't yet noticed. She whispered a greeting, palms pressed lightly to the glass. The glow from the lamps cast warm shadows across her face. "It's okay," she murmured. "Just a storm." But her voice lacked its usual certainty. Something in the room felt subtly different, like stepping into a place she knew well, but finding the furniture moved half an inch to the left. A sudden vibration jogged her pocket. Her phone buzzed. Lisa calling this time. Emily glanced at the screen, thumb hovering over the answer button. Outside wind struck the siding hard enough to make the heat lamp chains tremble. She ended the call and slid the phone onto a nearby shelf. 1 hour, she whispered to herself. Just need 1 hour. She knelt to refill the water dishes, adjusting each enclosure with practiced care, yet her movements felt slower, more cautious. Every sound, the clink of ceramic bowls, the whisper of bedding, seemed sharper than usual. The animals shifted more restlessly, reacting to the drop in barometric pressure. Even Orion's breathing was different, deeper, almost anticipatory. As she prepared the feeding tools, a faint metallic rattle echoed from above, the storm finally breaking, rain hitting the roof in uneven sheets. The room dimmed for a moment as the power flickered and Emily's heart gave a quick jolt. When the light steadied again, she exhaled, forcing a small laugh at her nerves. "Get a grip," she whispered. "Everything's fine." Yet the unease didn't leave. She moved to Orion's cage, checking the temperature display. It had dipped a few degrees, not dangerous, but enough to notice. She adjusted the controls, watching the numbers climb back up, and told herself it was just the weather. Snakes reacted to storms all the time. It didn't mean anything. But as she turned to gather the cleaning tools, Orion slid forward with a slow, weighty glide, pressing his head against the glass. Not striking, not stressed, just watching her with an intensity that caught her breath. She froze, hands still hovering above the table. A faint memory flickered. The bruise on her wrist, the near miss with Nate, Mr. Calvin's warning. She shook it off and forced herself to move again. "You're fine," she told him softly. "We've done this 100 times. Her voice sounded confident, but her shoulders remained tense. Outside, the wind rose again, howling against the windows like a long, low warning only nature could give. With everything prepared, she reached for the enclosure latch, then paused. Her hand hovered there, suspended between caution and routine. For a heartbeat, she considered waiting until tomorrow, until the weather passed, until she felt settled again. But storms made schedules tight. Snakes needed consistency, and Emily had never let fear dictate her choices. She clicked the latch open. The storm outside deepened, pushing against the walls of the house as if it wanted in. Inside the reptile room, the warmth and the red glow wrapped around Emily like a familiar blanket. She stepped forward, unaware that this ordinary motion, this single step into routine, was the line she would never cross back from. And just as she reached for Orion, the wind sucked hard against the window, rattling the panes, shaking the glass in its frame. It was a sound she'd heard 1,000 times, yet tonight it felt like the world itself was trying to say something. She didn't hear it, not the way she needed to. She whispered instead, almost tenderly, "Easy, boy. I'm right here." No one alive saw what happened in that room. There were no security cameras pointing at the reptile enclosures, no neighbor watching through the back window. But later, when the shock settled and the questions started, investigators and reptile experts pieced together a story from what was left behind. Positions of objects, marks on skin, the voicemail that still lived inside her phone. They knew the room had been warm, but not overheated. The thermostats logged a brief dip when the storm rolled in, then a small correction as Emily adjusted the settings. The power never fully failed, but the flicker was enough to unsettle the animals. Snakes don't panic like people do. They respond in instinctive ways, reading heat, movement, scent. That night, all three shifted at once. Emily would have opened Orion's enclosure, as she had many times before, one hand sliding the glass, the other ready to control his head if he moved too quickly. The feeding tongs and cleaning tools lay arranged neatly on the nearby table, exactly where someone preparing for a routine handling session would place them. There was no sign of chaos, no overturned racks, no broken glass. Whatever went wrong fast. Experts believe that when she reached in, Orion did what large constrictors sometimes do when food, motion, and stress collide. He likely moved toward her in what she recognized as normal behavior, lifting his body onto her forearm, sliding up toward her shoulders. It would have felt familiar, heavy but familiar. She had carried him like that before. To her, in that first moment, nothing was out of place. Somewhere in those next few seconds, things shifted. Perhaps her hand brushed his jawline in a way that echoed previous feedings. Perhaps the lingering scent of prey from cleaning the other enclosures clung stronger than she realized. Reticulated pythons are ambush predators. They don't argue, they don't threaten. When they decide to act, they simply do. The medical examiner later found no puncture wounds from a bite, only deep uniform compression marks across her neck and upper chest. That suggested Orion hadn't attacked her like prey from the start. He may have simply repositioned his body, coiling across her shoulders, then looping once, then twice around her throat. What began as contact could have become constriction with terrifying speed. Emily's first response was probably not panic, but correction. She would have tried to shift him, to slide her fingers under a coil and guide him down. The faint bruises on her forearms showed signs of that effort, fingertips pressing into dense muscle that this time didn't yield the way it always had. The angle of her body on the floor suggested she had stumbled backward, maybe as the lack of air made her vision tighten. At some point, she went down. The voicemail tells part of that story. The scrape at the beginning, the sound investigators later matched to her phone skidding across the tile, likely came when she tried to grab it from the shelf, overbalanced, and fell. The small metal bowl found upside down near her hip added another clatter to that moment. A room she controlled for years became a landscape of hazards in an instant. Her voice on the recording was already strained. That meant the coils were tight enough to compress her airway, but not yet so tight that she couldn't force a few words out. If anything happens. The pause after that line stretched longer than anyone wanted to think about. In that space, she might have tried to wedge weak fingers between scale and skin, to twist her body, to reach for something, anything that could pry him away. The most haunting detail came next. "Don't blame him. Please." Those 4 words didn't match what most people imagined they'd say while fighting for breath. But to those who knew Emily, and to the experts who listened, they fit. Even in that moment, she was framing the story the way she wanted it remembered. Not as an attack by a monster, but as a tragic collision of trust and nature. The autopsy showed no signs of prolonged struggle, no defensive wounds on her hands from striking the snake. That suggested that consciousness left her quickly once the pressure peaked. Constriction doesn't take long. Blood flow to the brain can falter in seconds. Muscles go slack before the mind fully understands what's happening. The science was cold, clinical. The reality in that quiet, red-lit room was anything but. When Mark and the deputy later described how easily Orion's coils unwound, one expert nodded grimly. "Once the heart stops," he explained, "they aren't interested anymore. They don't hold just to be cruel. They hold because they think they're feeding. When that's over, so is the squeeze." To many, that was the most chilling part, that the snake's behavior had no malice, no regret. It simply followed a script millions of years old. On the floor near Emily's right hand, investigators found a small hooked tool, the kind handlers sometimes use to guide a snake's head or unloop a stubborn coil. It was inches from her fingers, just out of reach. The paramedic who photographed the scene later admitted he had to stop and breathe when he saw that. "She almost had it," he said softly. "She almost made it." In the end, what happened in that room wasn't a mystery in the way people hoped it might be. There was no faulty lock, no intruder, no hidden drama. It was a series of tiny decisions and conditions, a storm, a scent, a moment of routine that lined up in exactly the wrong way. For everyone who loved her, that truth hurt more than any wild theory. It meant there was no villain to point to, no one to blame, except maybe the belief that love could rewrite instinct. What remained were the echoes, the scuff marks on the tile, the bowed-out imprint in the substrate where Orion had coiled afterward, the unread messages on her phone, and that voicemail, played over and over by people who never met her, trying to understand the kind of person who, with her last breath, chose to defend the very creature that took it. The morning after Emily's death, Ashton felt strangely muted, as if the storm had taken something from the town that the wind couldn't return. Neighbors stepped onto porches, slower than usual, gazing toward her small rental house with its taped-off driveway. The porch light that flickered the night before remained on, glowing weakly in the gray dawn. At the clinic, the news passed through whispered conversations and stunned silence. Her coworkers stood in the break room, holding styrofoam cups of coffee that went cold in their hands. Someone placed a small candle beside a photo of Emily, holding a rescued hawk. Its flame quivered each time the door opened, as if sharing the grief settling over the room. Lisa left work early, unable to focus. She sat in her car outside the clinic with Emily's voicemail open but not yet replayed. The air felt too thin, too sharp, like every breath came with splinters. When she finally pressed play, the message filled the small space, ragged breathing, the scrape of tile, those impossible final words. Lisa doubled over, the sound shattering whatever composure she had left. By afternoon, a small vigil formed outside Emily's house. Townsfolk placed flowers along the fence, sunflowers, wild asters, and a few roses that looked too formal for Ashton. Nate stood with his mother, clutching a drawing he had made of Emily and Orion, the snake curled gently around her shoulders the way he remembered it, not the way it ended. Mark kept to the edge of the gathering, arms folded tightly across his chest. He hadn't spoken much since the night before, not even to the deputy who asked him to recount the scene. Every detail replayed in his mind, the weight of Orion's coils, the terrible stillness of her body, the silence that felt louder than any scream. He wondered how many signs he had ignored out of love or fear. Later that evening, when the crowd thinned, Lisa approached Mark with tear-stained cheeks. Without speaking, she pressed her phone into his hand. "You need to hear it," she whispered. He hesitated, then hit play. Emily's breathless plea filled the quiet space between them. "Don't blame him. Please." Mark swallowed hard, the words landing like stones in his chest. In that moment, something cracked inside him. Not anger, but a kind of resigned understanding. Emily had loved Orion in a way that blurred the line between compassion and hopefulness. She believed he could be more than his instincts, more than evolution had shaped him to be. It wasn't naivety. It was who she was. She always saw the gentlest version of everything, even when the danger was plain. A week later, a town meeting was held in the community center. Officials, animal control officers, and concerned residents gathered to discuss the incident. Some demanded restrictions on exotic animals, their voices sharp with fear. Others defended responsible ownership, arguing that Emily's death was a rare tragedy, not a reason to punish everyone. The debate revealed more about the town than it did about snakes. Lisa stood to speak near the end. Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. She said Emily would never have wanted Orion demonized. She urged the town to create better safety protocols, not anger or blame. Her calm conviction softened the room. For the first time that night, people listened rather than argued. It was exactly the kind of balance Emily herself would have asked for. Mark spoke next. His voice was quieter than usual, rough around the edges. He confessed something he had never told anyone, that weeks before the accident, Emily admitted she felt Orion changing, heavier in his movements, more alert. She had said she would figure it out after the storm season, a timeline that now felt unbearably tragic. His words broke whatever silence remained. In the days that followed, local advocates began drafting a proposal informally called Savannah's Law, a name inspired by the online community that had started sharing Emily's story under the moniker Savannah Calloway. The proposed rules were simple: never handle large constrictors alone, maintain emergency tools within reach, train a second person for backup. They were the precautions Emily always meant to set next week. At home, Nate struggled to understand what had happened. One evening, he sat with his mother on their porch steps, watching the sun dip behind Ashton's quiet rooftops. "She said snakes could love you if you loved them first," he murmured. His mother wrapped an arm around him gently. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "snakes don't love or hate, they just are." Emily knew that, but she wanted them to be more. The reptile rescue that took Orion placed him with an experienced handler far from town. They didn't euthanize him. Emily's voicemail made sure of that. In a way, her last words became the only shield he had left. And for those who knew her best, protecting him felt like honoring the part of her that believed every creature deserved a chance, even the one that took hers. On the first clear night after the storm, Lisa and Mark visited the reptile room one last time. The enclosures were empty now, their glow extinguished. Emily's notes still hung neatly on the corkboard: feeding charts, temperature logs, small doodles she'd drawn in the margins. Mark traced a fingertip over her handwriting, letting the quiet fill the space she used to occupy so completely. As they locked the door behind them, Lisa whispered what everyone in Ashton eventually came to understand. Emily's last cry wasn't fear, it was love. Misplaced, complicated, beautiful, and devastating. The kind of love that hoped nature could bend if she cared hard enough. But nature didn't bend. It simply answered in the only language it knew. And somewhere in that truth, between instinct and intention, devotion and danger, lay the final lesson she left behind. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a simple 0 in the comments if you believe Emily's story was a tragic accident. Or type 1 if you think there's a deeper lesson here about trust and instinct. Your comment, even just a number, helps this story reach more people and keeps Emily's voice alive. And if this story held your attention, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe, stick with this channel, and join me for the next real-life encounter that will make you think twice, feel deeper, and see the world a little differently. More stories are coming, stories that stay with you long after the video ends. I'll see you in the next one.
If this story touched you the way it touched us, let me know with the simplest comment possible. Just type 1 if you felt hope, or narrow if it left you speechless.